Let's come back, and let's come back to one of the concerns that the Parayana is presenting. And they're not lectures, they're presentations. They're like presents, they're meant to be opened up, to be unfolded, which is a pleasure because they're beautiful ribbons, beautiful packaging, and wonderful gifts inside. Science is the 8th phase. Science is the second do in the octave. The first do is nature. This is why in the Learning Civilization program, science is able to overlap with nature and be in the same octave. But the same octave that has not only a linear stretch, but it has a harmonic that is included within it. Like a word that would begin with A and having 8 letters, the 8th letter would be A as well. So that it has a musical appreciation of it has a different quality. In Indian love of wisdom, Indian philosophy, the ability for sound to be analyzed and heard goes down to the origin of sound out of silence. The quality of the primordial sound, the phenomenal emergence of sound in the universe is actually the first move. And because it's the first move, it has the initial time signature. In Sanskrit, the term for that primordial sound is sphota, S-P-H-O-T-A, sphota. If you get interested, the first time I ran across it was reading into the 5 great volumes of Surendranath Dasgupta's History of Indian Philosophy. The first volume is Cambridge, 1922, and he worked on it till the end of his life. Dasgupta was a Calcutta-born and bred intellectual prodigy, and he was, for instance, the guru of Mircea Eliade. His origin of transforming from a Romanian adventurous rake to becoming one of the world's great yogic learners. There is a beautiful rendition of understanding the Svota by T.V. Kapila Shastri in a very rare book now. Sri Aurobindo lights on the teachings. And there's a whole chapter in here, the appreciation in the 20th century about understanding that sound is quite primordial. And Sri Aurobindo was as capable a yogi as one would ever need to find. He was in the early 20th century, he was a political revolutionary against the British imperial Raj. And because he was upper class Brahmin, they wanted to make an exemplar of him. We'll teach the masses by taking somebody from the top of the heap. And they threw him into jail, into prison. They threw him into a cell that measured 5 feet square, 5 feet by 5 feet, 25 square feet, and a ceiling of about 7 feet. They put him in this box and left him there for a year to break him. Yes, they fed him just enough to keep him breakable. He had nothing. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, but he could sit. And so he became a super yogi. And when they opened the door to let him out after a year, he was no longer Aurobindo Bose. He was Sri Aurobindo, one of the most powerful yogic savants of world civilization. This is a photo taken of Sri Aurobindo in 1950, right at the end of his life, and here he is with his woman, his wife, his lady companion of many, many decades. She was simply called the Mother. She was half French, half Egyptian. She used to be a very stylish Parisian Egyptian grande dame, princess, and when she heard Sri Aurobindo in the early years, the 1920s, she immediately understood that this is really a very special man. And so they were together. They formed together a city in South India, south of what used to be called Madras, of Chennai now, but south of Madras. And it was called Auroville. And one of the books on Auroville is The Word Rising. Trust for the Earth is the subtitle. And it was to be the first city for a different kind of humanity that was able to penetrate language in such a way that one would refine the learning by language as a musician in classical India refines his sense of sound and music by composition from sphota into all of the different possibilities of sound, into all the different possibilities of scalars and music, and that the creme de la creme of all of this is the raga, the different kinds of raga that there are. And it is possible, as was shown in the 1960s in San Francisco, Berkeley, that there can be rock ragas. Ravi Shankar, who studied for 30 years under the father of his fellow student, Ali Akbar Khan, Ustad Akbar Khan. Akbar is victorious. Khan is the royal victorious of the first quality of heroic. After 30 years of study with Ustad Akbar Khan, he was brought to the United States by a man named Richard Bach, not the author of the great book, Richard Bach, but a Richard Bach who was a music entrepreneur here in Los Angeles. I was very close to him and his wife, Janet Bach. And he's the one that first brought Ravi Shankar to the West, to the United States, to California, to participate in letting people know that there is such a thing as a raga that can even translate into the kind of hard rock 60s music. And when he was chosen in 1969 to be part of the Monterey Pop Festival of 1970, he composed his own. You don't write it out so much as you compose it so that you hold it into your musicality, scalar complex, into your harmonic reel, and then you perform it. And his Ale Raka on the tabla and so forth, and he played the composition Dun, D-H-U-N, Dun, for the early 1970s Monterey Pop Festival. It's about a 15-minute raga, and it ends in the most incredible array of rhythmic crescendo within crescendo into emergence, into absolute joy. When I was hired to go into Canada, Western Canada, Calgary, in May of 1970, I planned to give my first presentation in Calgary, the new 15-acre architectural gem of a university without walls was still being finished, and it hadn't been finished yet. So my initial lecture was going to be in the city planetarium, a 600-seat venue. And I chose to give my initial presentation on the Bhagavad Gita, but having a musical background of Dun. And because it was a planetarium, I had a star show going on at the same time. I found a Canadian who had this beautiful quality of being able to recite in ancient Sanskrit and also into English. And so it was punctuated. It's not just the Bhagavad Gita, but it's this rock version, raga, of the way in which we are emerging into something completely fresh, recognizable as, quote, the cutting edge, but it isn't cutting. It's like the old word cutter that Philo of Alexandria used to talk about. That is the making of the prismatic quality of language by taking time, rhythmic, harmonics into complexity so that you're able to understand that you can hear, you can appreciate, you can compose on so many levels that you couldn't write it down adequately, so you play it with freedom. Later on, Ali Akbar Khan did a similar thing to Indian music. He made the first bluegrass raga. What's interesting is that when you go into the art out of vision, consciousness in its dimensions becomes joyous. And what is the differential consciousness of vision? Coming through the prismatic person of the artist gives you a completely new scalar. It's like a matrix of rainbows. When you digitize language, at the same time you digitize color and can digitize tone, can digitize time to any degree of filigree that you wish to have. Here is yesterday's little net posting, physics review letters, physical reviews letter. A team of researchers working at the experimental storage ring in Darmstadt, Germany, that's near Hamburg in northern Germany, where Thomas Mann was from, have conducted an experiment using ions pushed to 40% of the speed of light to verify time dilation to a new level of precision. What is the level of precision? A few parts per billion. It is Einstein, in his special theory of relativity, that posits time dilation, that as you approach the speed of light, time slows down in terms of its measurement, in terms of its calibration. If one were to actually achieve the speed of light, you would have an infinite mass and no time. Which becomes understandable, finally, now, here, in the 21st century, almost 100 years later. In fact, more than 100 years later. 1905 was the special theory, and the general theory about a decade after that. Time, being the first dimension, emerges spontaneously, not in time. As soon as it has emerged, now there is phenomenally an instantaneousness. And the first emergence instantaneously out of time is space. So that there is a time signature at the very origins of emergence. So that to be able to hear the silence out of which Svota emerges is the very beginnings of what we would call the universe. The second posting on the net, early today actually, how baryon acoustic oscillation reveals the expansion of the universe. Baryon oscillation, acoustically. Imagine a stadium filled with people. Everyone is in their seats waiting for the game to begin. There is an undercurrent of noise. A few words between friends, the scuffle of shoes, the creak of a chair, all of these little sounds fill the stadium with a background of white noise. Because you cannot hear the individual sounds, it acquires a smear that seems like a random white noise. It's like the hiss of the echo of the Big Bang that was heard in 1966 by a couple of men experimenting with very sophisticated acoustics to try and hear very, very far away faint things. And at first they thought it must be pigeons fluttering in the great hearing, and then they finally realized that the sound comes from the universe. And translated into temperature, it comes from 3 degrees Kelvin. The motion on the atomic level of original hydrogen still has an echo signature of the birth of the universe. After all this time, audible. When it came out, NASA at JPL, there were many people who were wondering, well, if sound is that primordial, it must also be distributed to all of the things that we're looking at. And so some geniuses got together to say there must be then a sound of a planet in orbit around the sun. And actually, they were able to find that, and they made a little whistle. They used to have one, where it made a very high-pitched sound that one could not hear, but with experience and amplification, one could hear the sound of the planet in orbit. And that all of the planets have this, and later on it was translated into a whole series that one could finally modulate together and hear the star system moving. Here now, sound is a vibration in air, As objects vibrate, they create variations in air pressure, and those variations propagate through the air as waves of sound. If we could see these sound waves, they would look like ripples moving through air molecules. These ripples cause the air molecules to be bunched together a bit in some regions, higher pressure, and spread apart more in others, lower pressure. All the sounds create these ripples, and all these ripples, sound ripples, overlap. As a result, the small noises in the stadium create a seemingly random variation of clustered air molecules. And since sound waves spread outwards at the speed of sound, the size of these ripples are all very similar. If speeds of sound were faster, the ripples would be more spread out, and if the speed of sound were slower, they would be closer together. Thus, the scale of sound ripples in the stadium is determined by the speed of sound. If we could see the ripples, and so forth. As a boy wondering, I had the reoccurring sense of being in the stage in front of a proscenium of a vast stadium, packed, to see what I would do. But the refinement to this, the high Dharma refinement, it is not sound waves alone that make a ripple. They make the ripple in air. But the true ripple is in space, three-dimensional space. And that ripple is caused by gravity waves. And those gravity waves are from the instantaneousness of the spontaneously emerged time. So that time produces a quaver of gravitational waves in a phenomenal universe, which is why if one goes to a zero time, in Zen called emptiness, shunyata, or an infinite time, there are no ripples yet, but there is distinctly a smoothness, continuity that is infinite, that can begin its dance of gravitation. Orbital science thinks it's big stuff to have 0 G's. The real high Dharma 0 G is what Jesus in Alexandria used to call rest, with a capital R, my rest, which can be entered into because one is able to go more primordial than the universe, or is able to go more infinite than the cosmos. And that all of this is habitable with a very, very rare high Dharma perspective. And that this can be learned. This is a quality that comes into play in such peculiarities that seemingly impossible, there are no statistical happenings for this at all, and yet it occurs. When H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine and published it in 1895, it took a while for the reverberations to occur. One of the reverberations 10 years later was Einstein's theory of special relativity, having to do with time. Because by that time, Wells was like really one of the most read people on the planet ever. But especially in England, where Wells shifted not only from writing these fantastic science fiction romances, as they used to be called in the 1890s, and became socially quite adept, and finally realizing that one had to really write a combed out history of the world. And in 1920, right after the First World War had shattered everything that anybody ever knew about civilization, he published his great two-volume history, outline of history, which, because of his fame, because of his writing acumen, because of his dramatic presentational genius, because everyone was hungry. What has happened? How can this go on? We were riding horses in Hyde Park in beautiful carriages, and now our dead are by the millions because of mechanized tanks that would roll over any kind of carriage, however expensive it was. And mustard gas anybody who got in the way. How can this happen? Out of that came a generation of young writers, in England especially, who were completely, quixotically fed up with normal so-called ways of writing and subjects about being written. And one of the geniuses then was Olaf Stapleton. And one of his earliest, quote, science fiction novels was First and Last Men in London. But the creme de la creme, the crown of Olaf Stapleton's science fiction vision and novels, was called Odd John, published in 1937, about the time that the neutron had been discovered, and it was being realized that there was a possibility of having, because the atomic nucleus not only had protons, but had neutrons, it was possible to split a neutron by fission so that its electron-proton stability as a neutral electric charge was split, and the electron that was split off from the neutron would able to be instantly catapulted to another neutron and another and another, and that this splitting, this fission, would in a flash to us, which is like a rush in attosecond physics, would produce an atomic bomb. Odd John was republished in the intensity of the Korean War as it increased in its virulence, and in 1951 as a part of a series of republishing classics of the science fiction vision into a new paper series. And the person in charge of that was H.L. Gold. H.L. Gold was a science fiction writer from the 30s who flourished during a few years and then went to the Second World War, where he was injured and traumatized almost beyond belief. And one of the things that came out of it was that his freedom of movement was impaired, so that he became not only claustrophobic, but almost unable to leave his apartment. And so for him, reading and writing science fiction became not just an avocation, but became the only way that he could travel. And when he received the opportunity to make a new science fiction magazine in 1950, almost at the time that the Korean War broke out, June of 1950. I remember it very clearly. In toy stores, I was still 9, all of a sudden there were soldiers again available for little boys to play with, just like in the Second World War. And the beautiful adventure comics of characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, who were adventurous, became cartoon figures, emasculated, being something that was unthinkable to the Mickey Mouse of the 1930s and 40s, became M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E, the epitome of reduction to childishness. But at the same time, H.L. Gold brought out the new magazine in October of 1950, on my 10th birthday, Galaxy Science Fiction magazine. And it was so successful because it displaced the way in which the science fiction vision had been pulp magazine oriented, with nubile, scantily clad women in the clutches of incredible monsters or diabolical sciences. And out of that pulp fiction, science fiction had been written seemingly for adolescents, that a peak of mid-thigh in the clutches of some grim, gruesome thing was tantalizing enough to buy the issue. Galaxy magazine came out in October 1950, and on the back of it, it always had the comparison of Western, mystery, science fiction, all the same thing, only giving it different characters and different settings. And the caption at the bottom, you'll never find this in Galaxy. You will always find something that is a new literature. It's a literature. One of the Galaxy science fiction novels was Odd John by Olaf Stapleton, republished in 1951, just about the time that Douglas MacArthur's Incheon landing had shifted the Korean War to where American-led UN troops got to the banks of the Yalu River, across which was China. And businessman elected vice president turned president, Harry Truman, recalled MacArthur because he said, we have to cross the Yalu to stop this. I remember being sat down with all of the students in grade school to hear MacArthur's coming home final speech. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Exactly at that time, Odd John was republished by H.L. Gold, whom I was pleased enough to meet courtesy of my old friend Theodore Sturgeon, who was one of the stars of the new Galaxy magazine. And H.L. lived in Park La Brea here, and didn't go out, of course, and I was taken there by Sturgeon one afternoon, and we spent a whole afternoon. I took my first 3 issues of Galaxy, October, November, December 1950, and had Gold signed them for me. One of the covers for Odd John, 1951, the summer of 1951, Odd John is a mutant human who has an IQ of 2 million. He dwarfs what we used to think is smart into infinitesimalness. And he is so engendering of jealousy by others who are unable to appreciate that someone like this could be legitimate, could be real. He's forced to leave society, to hide away on an island with a small population of people who are beginning to learn to live on a level that has a 2 million IQ reality. This is Barack Obama. This is a primordial visioning that brings a differential conscious quality to where kaleidoscopic history has a unheard of occurrence that has no probability whatsoever, but from a zero field meeting an infinite field, which is real, regardless of what anybody wants to think. In 1941, 10 years before, Theodore Sturgeon wrote a short story called Microcosmic God. When they, in Berkeley, North Atlantic Books put out a 14-volume collection of Theodore Sturgeon's stories, Sturgeon said one of his triumphs, this was in the mid-1970s, he was saying to me, one of the triumphs of my life is that I have made enough money to buy back the copyright of all my stories so that I own the copyright of my own work. Microscopic God is about a brilliant scientist on an island like Odd John, off in the Pacific somewhere like Odd John, who is able to breed microscopic humans who are the size almost of viruses, whose lifespan is so quick that they are able to have human lives to themselves, but so rapidly that it becomes like a petri dish universe. And to them, they understand that their creator is God. In 2014, just 2 weeks ago, it was reported on the net, I'll bring the science article next week, of being able to now have laboratory surveillance and analytic over generations of viruses so that one can analyze their colonies, their lives, thousands of times per hour, millions of times per day, so that microscopic gods are at work in the 21st century. This is an early photo of H.G. Wells in 1915. He had just turned 50 years of age. And this is a photograph of Wells in Los Angeles, in the Hollywood of Los Angeles. The man he's talking to here is Carl Laemmle, one of the early producers of silent film classics here in Los Angeles. The buildings behind were Laemmle Studios, then they became RKO Studios, then they became Republic Pictures Studios. Now they're Channel 7 ABC TV in Los Angeles. All of this is not only true, but it has a high Dharma understanding that we can learn how to learn. And our appreciation can prismatically recut the artist of ourselves and each other, so that sharing doesn't displace controlling, but that it transforms controlling, and that sharing creates an intercommunal quality of history, which then generates a new distillation of differential consciousness to kaleidoscopic consciousness. Their real science of the cosmos can become real. That's what we're doing. More next week.